Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now this is Palit's RTX 3060. It's one of the smallest, most compact 3060s available right now, and at around £460. It's also the cheapest here in the UK, often priced very similar to the AMD Radeon 6600 XT. Both are too expensive for the performance they offer, but then again, everything is, and it looks like things will remain this way for a while. This thing's price and often in-stock status will still make it a tempting purchase for some, so of course all we can do is review it as normal by taking a look at its gaming performance and features. Sitting between a 2070 and 2070 Super in terms of gaming performance on paper, the 12GB Palit 3060 features a 1320MHz clock speed, 1777MHz boost clock and an 1875MHz memory clock. These are reference speeds, but this is usually the case with single fan, small form factor cards. The Palit 3060 is powered by a single 8-pin connector, has a touch of RGB, and boasts 0 decibel technology, meaning that the fan stops under light load. Now this isn't anything new, but we don't always get this with single fan cards, so it's a welcome inclusion. Having said that, it does get quite audible when gaming, but it's bearable, more so if you have your PC under your desk. For the gaming benchmarks, I've tested the card at 1080p and 1440p, but we'll be discussing DLSS and ray tracing in separate tests towards the end of the video. I'll also throw up some comparative results between this and the 6600 XT later on. For now though, let's focus primarily on the Palit 3060's gaming capabilities. Kicking things off, we have Cyberpunk 2077 at 1080p with the high preset. Now I've made some personal adjustments to the visuals by turning off motion blur and depth of field, but nothing else has been altered. At 1080p you aren't going to have many, if any, problems with this card. It's a decent gamer, especially if you don't care about ray tracing, which is probably best left off anyway, but as I said, we'll talk about that more later. At 1440p, the high preset in Cyberpunk is a bit too much for the card to handle. The game is still playable, but you won't be seeing a 60 FPS average. 40 to 50 is more like it, but even so, this is still very much enjoyable, and perhaps an acceptable sacrifice in exchange for crispier visuals. If we drop things to medium instead, then we get a visually similar looking game, especially as the textures are still set to high, but we now get that 60 FPS average. Almost, anyway. As we move on to Black Ops Cold War, it's worth noting that the temperature of the card hasn't exceeded 70 degrees. That's a pretty impressive number for a single fan compact card, but as I mentioned before, the fan will certainly become quite audible in order to retain these temps. Have a listen. I'm pretty much demonstrating a worst case scenario because my card's on the desk with nothing to dampen the noise, and even then it's not too bad in my opinion. Nothing I wouldn't expect from a single fan GPU. Back to the performance then, and Black Ops Cold War will run absolutely fine at 1080p high with native scaling. We could push the settings slightly higher and enable ray tracing, but there's no need, and considering that this is an online competitive shooter, the more frames you can get the better. Now we can retain the same settings at 1440p as well, though anyone looking for a 120 FPS experience may want to make a few changes. Despite having built-in recording capabilities with GeForce Now, everything was recorded externally using a capture card and another PC. So everything you see here is exactly what you'll get performance-wise when pairing the 3060 with an i5-10400 and 16GB of DDR4 dual-channel memory. Crysis Remastered was certainly a little more demanding than I thought it would be, especially considering that ray tracing was switched off. That said, we are still getting at least 60 FPS all of the time with the high preset, and the game looks fantastic. I think this may be a particularly demanding area as well. Keeping the high preset as we switch to 1440 means that there will be some dips below 60, although the average will still work out at around 60 because some areas are far less intensive than others. Now personally, I think the 3060 is better than a lot of reviewers gave it credit for, but it is understandable when looking at the price as to why it was slated. You should definitely see how the price of 2070 Supers compare where you live if you're thinking about buying something like the 3060, and once again, anyone who bought the 1080 Ti for MSRP years ago, well, that was a big brain move. Moving on to Fortnite, and although the average frame rate was good, I experienced the same stutter as I did before with the 6600, which occurs at random intervals but seems to be more CPU or game related. I opted for the medium preset once again here. Switching to 1440p, and again like my previous 6600 XT test, the game ran smoother overall. The average frame rate was lower, which is to be expected of course, but Fortnite felt much smoother to play this time around. Next up we have the beautiful Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020 at the high end preset with real-time weather enabled. I'm surprised it's not raining. If we were testing this months ago then we would have certainly run into more issues, but since the optimization patch, this title runs great on a wider variety of hardware. Flying above the busy city of London is posing no issues for our 3060, and again the temperatures are staying below 70. Just because we're flying a plane doesn't mean you want your graphics card to sound like a jet engine, and luckily it's staying fairly cool and quiet. Or maybe you do want to make your graphics card sound like a jet engine. I mean, that would make things even more immersive, I guess. 1440p with the same high-end preset also holds up very well with the 60 FPS average. There's not much else to say here as the game is performing really nicely on this card, so we may as well move on to an aging classic, GTA 5. For GTA 5 I maxed out every setting apart from MSAA, which absolutely decimates performance even with modern hardware. Without it, the 3060 managed at least 100 FPS on average. GTA can go from being one of the most low-end hardware-friendly games out there to one of the most demanding in an instant, if you want to crank the settings right up. It's certainly a very inclusive game, that's for sure. Now it also performs very well at 1440p with the same maxed out settings, except from MSAA of course. The 1 and 0.1% lows were very respectable too, indicating little to no frame dips, something that tends to be the case for GTA. It's usually a very smooth game to play. Another Rockstar open world now, and this time it's Red Dead Redemption 2. Now I chose to cause some carnage in and around the town of Valentine with the game's equivalent console settings. These give us a nice balance between visual quality and frame rates, though we could have certainly turned things up higher, and we will actually do that in a moment. The 3060 has no problems with 1440p either, with the same settings applied. Everything looks a bit sharper overall, and we're still getting at least 60 FPS from this compact graphics card. Now, because this is an RTX card, we have to talk about both DLSS and ray tracing. In my opinion, DLSS is the real star of the show. Ray tracing is nice, but it's a feature best enabled by high-end RTX owners, because otherwise the performance sacrifice isn't worth the visual difference, at least not in my opinion. With that said, a combination of DLSS and ray tracing is a different story. First of all though, let's check out the differences DLSS can make. Using the highest available preset in Red Dead Redemption 2 at 1440p will give us about 50 FPS on average. Not bad considering we're using ultra settings. Enabling the Performance DLSS preset however will boost our frame rate to above 60 on average, with minimal visual impact. Now I do wish that Nvidia DLSS was available for lower end cards that need it more. Sort of like AMD FSR that works with anything, for example. Another example of where DLSS works wonders is with Cyberpunk. Using the Ultra preset at 1440p offers up a playable plus 30 FPS experience, but that's not ideal for everyone. You can either turn the resolution down, turn the settings down, or enable the DLSS performance preset once again to see a huge boost in performance. This time we've gone from 40 to 60 FPS with a slightly more noticeable impact to visuals than with Red Dead, but the image is still pretty sharp overall. So let's throw ray tracing into the mix as well. Cyberpunk at 1080p with the high preset runs very well without ray tracing effects enabled, as you can see. Enabling ray tracing and using the medium lighting setting will cut our frame rate in half. Now, as I said before, I'm not really a fan of ray tracing. I think it's a setting best reserved for higher end hardware, but thanks to our good friend DLSS, why decide between visual quality and performance when you can have both? Now, granted, enabling DLSS at 1080p does make the image look noticeably softer, but if you wanted to enable all the extra lighting effects and keep performance at a plus 60 FPS average, you could do so. And this is part of the appeal with the 3060. It's something that may make it more desirable than the 6600 XT as well. I then thought, well, why don't we really go all out and max a couple of games out with 4K and ray tracing to see if DLSS could make them playable. This probably isn't the best way to play with a card like this, but it was certainly fun. 60 frames per second is also out of the question, but a plus 30 FPS average isn't too much to ask for at all. Cyberpunk at the 4K Ultra Ray Tracing preset ran with about 40 frames per second with the Ultra Performance DLSS option enabled. Now, somehow I managed not to crash my motorbike either during this action-packed benchmark run. I really do not know how I did it. This reminds me of E3 gameplay, to be honest, like before everything gets a little bit downgraded and made to run on lower end hardware. Crysis 2020 with the Can It Run Crysis preset at 4K with ray tracing ran quite similar to Cyberpunk with around 40 FPS and the occasional dip. It looks excellent and it's playable to an extent, but I should reiterate that you will get much more enjoyment out of a native 1440p 60 FPS experience at lower settings, not only for the sake of visual fidelity but for the sake of a more consistent performance. Now, to finalise, here is how the Palit 3060 compared in terms of average frame rates to the closely priced 6600 XT in a handful of today's tested games. The 6600 XT usually comes out on top, but honestly, DLSS for the 3060 with its wider support in modern titles may make this Nvidia option more tempting overall. It's all down to personal preference, of course. I guess it depends on where you live as well, because prices could be much different wherever you are in the world. I've certainly enjoyed my time with the 3060 so far, despite the obvious downfall being the price tag, which is somewhat unavoidable at the moment. And all that's left to say is thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like, leave a dislike if you didn't. Let me know which card you choose between the 6600 XT and the 3060, because I'd like to hear your opinions in the comments down below. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and hopefully I'll see all of you in the next one.